Hello there, my name is Jared, and welcome to the Jared Show Wisdom Podcast. This episode is about something called Scientism. What happens when science becomes more like science fiction? Welcome to the show. In the last episode, we took a look at science. How science seems to be at odds with God and religion. It seems that science holds a monopoly on giving most people answers. We start our education as young as 5, and from there we are learning about how the earth and the world work. All the way from kindergarten through till 12th grade, we are told what we should know and never trained to ask questions or think critically about the information we are supposed to absorb, especially in public schools. It's up to each one of us to review the material later on in life and actually sort out if what we learned is actually a fact or just came from a book that we are given and told has nothing but facts in them, called textbooks. Putting your trust in a book for all the answers as a guide to life without questioning it sounds familiar. We'll get to more about that after this little break. Before we go, I'd like to ask, do you believe in science? We'll be right back in just a minute. Welcome back to the Jared Show Wisdom Podcast. The question before the break, do you believe in science, may seem odd. But it is a good question because it forces us to ask another question. Do I have to believe in science? Usually I think we're under the assumption that science is just facts, a collective knowledge. As we went over the previous episode, that's really what science means, is knowledge. And around the 14th century or 17th century, as we progressed in our human understanding of the world around us, we came to think of science as a all-encompassing term, collective knowledge. But we have progressed and gone beyond that collective knowledge in many different ways. But what we're talking about today is what's called scientism. That's how science went from science facts to science fictions. Simply put, scientism is a religion based on science that I think most people are members of and don't even know it. Now, that's a pretty bold statement, but let's examine things a bit more. So what is this religion of scientism made up of? Well, it's mostly made up of layers of theories. Specifically, theories that are loosely based on facts and presented as facts, but are really just theories. A couple of theories that come to mind that are presented as facts are the evolution of man, not to be confused with adaptation. And another big theory would be the Big Bang Theory. Perhaps you've seen the show. Personally, I'm not a big fan. I'm not a big fan of the show, and I'm not a big fan of the theory. Now, these two theories are taught in schools as basic facts. But let's look at each and see why they are really more belief than fact. Now, we won't get too deep into either one, but it's interesting just to get to the core basis of each to understand that it really takes belief in these two theories to make them facts. Especially without getting too deep into evolution, why evolution may be wrong, let's look at some of the basic concepts. In school, we are taught that nothing created everything. Specifically, that an infinitesimal point, I've seen it in various textbooks where it says a point smaller than the period on this page, filled with an enormous amount of energy, just exploded and started to expand. This, in essence, is the Big Bang Theory. But wait, let's pause there before we keep going. And you get into everything expands and all these chemicals come together and the really implausible probability of life coming out of explosion, not to mention entropy and thermodynamics, everything breaking down. It's interesting with this theory that really what we see in our lifetime, given enough time, if you lay out a piece of fruit on your table, it will eventually decompose and break down, and maybe those seeds will get planted and that'll create another tomato or a piece of fruit or whatever it is that you put there. But at the end of the day, it didn't get better, right? And our world, generally, everything that you see within the world, within the earth, these things are decomposing, breaking down. Even our bodies break down. So what's interesting with this theory is that when you stop and you don't go any further, you just look at the very beginning of what that theory is, that a dot that had an enormous amount of energy enough to create everything in our known universe, however big you want to estimate that to be, exploded. You still have to recognize the fact that you haven't explained where everything came from yet, because you haven't explained where that dot came from. And I've had this conversation with many people, many different types of beliefs, many different types of educational levels. One question I've always gotten is, you can ask somebody that believes in evolution. Personally, I don't believe in evolution because of the fact that it never really truly explains anything. It leaves you with the question of, okay, so what caused the Big Bang? Where did the infinitesimal, the really, 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 really small dot, smaller than the period on a page, where did that come from? That's not science. That's a belief system in something. So I don't necessarily believe in evolution, and I always ask people that question: do you believe in evolution? And I think a lot of people will answer that question just as I've asked the question before the break: do you believe in science? In science, you don't have to believe in science, because science, as we looked at in the previous episode, deals with the scientific method. That means that you can draw conclusions from an experiment that you've done, a recreatable experiment, by the way. Now, let's say I, for instance, created an experiment and I got the result of dropping a penny into a bucket of water, created a gold brick. Now, if I did that one time and I had nothing to back up that conclusion, I just said that, right? I came out and said, well, I dropped a penny into a bucket of water and it created a gold brick. If nobody else could recreate that experiment, then it's not a scientific fact, and we'll get into that in a little bit later, but science it's fact-based. It's not theory-based. So when you go past science, which is fact-based, and you get into theory-based, that's when you've crossed from science into science fiction. And really, because you believe those things, it becomes a religion, and that religion basically has been coined, pun intended, it's been coined Scientism, the belief in the theories that are put forth, evolution, these kind of things. Science cannot answer those ideas, and the reason it can't answer those ideas when it comes to evolution is a theory. And personally, after having done a lot of research, a lot of reading, a lot of studying, watching different things, and these kind of things, I've come to the conclusion personally that it's a bad theory. As I said, evolution, when it comes to adaptation, makes sense. That is to say, that a dog and a wolf share the same species, and those species can adapt to their surroundings. But when it comes to evolution of species, when it comes to saying a dog can become an elephant, it doesn't really hold water. And, that's really just a belief system. Unfortunately, what we're forced to do when it comes to evolution, first of all, we're forced to absorb that all the way as far back as 5th grade, as I said in the beginning. We're introduced to this idea in 5th grade. We're going to go over that in just a minute, but we're forced to absorb that. But second of all, most people have absorbed that, and they're waiting on those theories to be proven. And unfortunately, we kind of have to just take science's word for it right now and have faith that even though this Big Bang theory is unproven, at some point in the future, scientists will find the answer as to what caused the Big Bang. How about evolution of species? Basically, how did man evolve all the way from single-cell organisms through the evolutionary chain to become what we are today, basically hairless apes. So this theory comes from Mr. Charles Darwin. I'm sure many of us are familiar with the name. Perhaps not all of us have read his book. It's called Origin of Species. I will admit I've read probably about as much as most people have. I haven't read the whole book. It's quite interesting. I say this, and I can hear the other side of things. I've asked a lot of people, do you believe in evolution? And they look at you kind of funny. They give you this idea, and then it's debatable back and forth between creation and evolution. Personally, given the evidence, I am definitely on the side of creation. I'm not at this point. I haven't gotten into my set of belief systems yet. With this podcast and what we're doing here, we're just kind of going through some fact-based things so that we can all kind of stand on one foundation here. So I'm not trying to sway you in any direction. I haven't gotten to that yet. I'm looking at just the truth, the absolute truth of something. If something is the truth, it will continue to be the truth. It won't change. It won't be clarified. It won't need better equipment to get better observations, to get better numbers for it. The truth is, an absolute truth is something that doesn't change. So where I'm going is I've talked to a lot of people, and I asked them, have you read the Bible? And they'll say, well, I've read pieces of it, bits and pieces of it. And what's interesting is I'm quite the same way with Origin of Species. When it comes to Charles Darwin, I've seen the results of Charles Darwin. I've seen the teachings, we'll put it that way, of Charles Darwin. But I find more interesting, actually on both accounts, as far as the Bible and Charles Darwin, the background of Charles Darwin and the background of the Bible as well. But just to give you a little background on Mr. Darwin, I call him Chuck D, which is kind of a young people's joke if you're familiar with the rapper Chuck D. But Charles Darwin was actually studying to be a clergyman or a parson. By the way, parson is akin to priest. So if you've ever heard that song Winter Wonderland, and you hear in that song it says, we'll build a snowman and call him Parson Brown. So parson is not someone's name, it's a title, much like priest. So Parson Brown would be like Priest Brown or Father Brown or whatever you want to call them. So it's much the same. So it's kind of a weird song when you actually break down and figure what that means. But that's basically what Charles Darwin was studying to be, was parson. So you would have called him Parson Darwin, I guess. He did not make it, unfortunately. Basically, he wanted to be a clergyman or a parson. He basically wanted to work for the church, is what it comes down to. But he set sail on the second voyage of the HMS Beagle, and he was actually greatly influenced. He was reading a book by Charles Lyell, called Principles of Geology. And while he was on this voyage, he was really greatly influenced by the way this book describes geology. And basically the book, Principles of Geology, talks about how geology, how all of this formed, how the earth changed over time and not through cataclysm or not catechism, but not over catastrophism. Basically volcanoes and active earthquakes and having catastrophes that would change the face of the earth. Even things like glaciers, carving out different things and this kind of thing. He was of the idea that things happen gradually over time. And I think Darwin was greatly influenced by this idea, and also where he was studying as well. So on this voyage, he's reading this book, and he goes to many different islands, including the famous one, the one he's known for, Galapagos Islands, and finds the birds with different beaks, which is really adaptation. This isn't evolution of species, but this voyage that he's on is much more than just the Galapagos Islands. He is on this voyage for about 5 years. And I think he spends a total of about 18 months at sea and about 3.5 years or so, or more, island hopping and going to different places all over the world, or all over the earth. And Darwin actually collected and made detailed observation of plants and animals, with results that shook his belief that species were fixed, and actually provided the basis for ideas which came to him while back in England. And these ideas sparked the theory of evolution by natural selection for Darwin. So this is all well and good, but science will always ask. It doesn't matter who you are. It will always ask, even if it is Mr. Darwin, it will always ask, where is the proof for that theory, Mr. Darwin? Natural selection, or the theory of biological evolution, has what's called missing links, gaps in time where there are no fossils. Things get much more inventive when you actually start looking at evolution by natural selection. I'll save that information for some other time. The last thing I will say about evolution for now is I don't see it. Now, perhaps this is an oversimplification on some of the things that we're talking about here. But what I mean by that is I don't see any ape men. I don't see the gap, so to speak, between ape men and who we are, Homo sapien, all of these different distinctions, these different things that we go up into. And it's a big problem within the theory of evolution. It's said that if you took all of the bones that prove evolution and put them all together, they would cover about 2 tables. Do you remember the tables when you were in school? They probably still have them. That you would open up. They had the little folding things, right? And they were these little tables that were, I don't know, maybe 3 feet by 6 feet or so. It said that all of the evidence to support evolution, not adaptation, but evolution of species, can fit on those 2 tables quite comfortably. Now, that's not a whole lot of evidence, given supposedly we've been here for, I think, what is it, 4 million, 10 million, some absurd number of million of years. And don't even get me started on carbon dating. As far as I've seen, it's a pretty unreliable source. The half-life of a specific isotope, and just the idea that half-life is still the same now as it was millions of years ago or yesterday. Very interesting. But like I said, I'm not really trying to get into evolution. I'm trying to get to the derivative. I'm trying to get all the way down to the concepts of basic concepts. So we all know that there are gaps within this fossil record. We all know that there are no ape men right now. We all know all these things, yet we accept these theories as facts. I think that's interesting. And like I said, we're not talking about adaptation here, right? So we're talking about types of species that are going from one to the other. And with types of species, you're talking about, like I said before, dogs and wolves are part of the canine species. But what Darwin is talking about is one changing to the other. So cats changing to dogs, for instance, or elephants changing to giraffes, right? I'm not talking about adaptation. And what Charles Darwin talks about on the Galapagos Islands with these birds that have different beaks is really just adaptation, right? Even human beings are most of the time capable of adapting given their situation, whether they're in cold climate or a warm climate, a jungle versus woods versus ocean. We adapt to our surroundings, so do animals. And they gradually adapt to things, but they don't go from, you're not going to have, birds becoming monkeys, right? So these are much different things. And even though we have briefly looked into a deep subject here, that of evolution, we're going to definitely do a whole show on evolution itself. Right now I'm trying to use the basics to see how adding a theory onto scientific observation really requires faith. In order to believe in evolution, you have to believe Charles Darwin, you have to believe in the author of the textbook or Origin of Species. You have to believe in all of these theories and ideas, and not go on a whole lot of facts. And then you have to even believe how those facts are arranged, even. Before we go to break, I'd like to ask, are you smarter than a fifth grader? We'll return after this short break. Welcome back to the Jared Show Wisdom Podcast. So, are you smarter than a fifth grader? How many of us have seen that show and had a good laugh, trying to remember the things that we learned in fifth grade? Interestingly enough, fifth grade is where evolution starts to be taught to kids in many schools across the country. And how many of us just go on the assumption that evolution is a fact in life? Something that we learned long ago, and because we learned it so long ago, there's really no reason to revisit it. It's not like we are still in school, right? There's no test coming up on it. or we're really not going to use that in our everyday lives. But it does create a specific worldview of things. We'll get into that a little deeper a little later, but as I said in the beginning of this episode, it's up to us to go back and question the things we were taught in school to see if they match up, if they're true or if they're not. But how many of us actually do that? I think few go back and question what they have learned, or the validity of the textbooks they learned from. Let me ask you this. Do you know who writes those textbooks? Do you care? Have you ever looked? I don't. I don't know who writes all those textbooks. I think fewer still, especially in 5th grade, question the material they are learning. And if they do, it is really thought to be a problem with the student and not with the teacher or the content of the material being taught. Not only is the material being taught above reproach, even though it's just a theory, as we have seen, but even if a 5th grader wanted to question it, how many 5th graders are articulate enough to form a valid argument against the teacher, the textbook, and, well, everyone, I guess, including, most of the time, their own parents? Yet the theory of evolution is based on just that, theory. No real physical evidence. I mean, I say that as if, it's just a fact, but seriously, go look into these things yourself. There's an interesting scholar I like that I've seen, and I've seen many different debates on this. I've watched hours and hours of debates of professors versus, Bible teachers and Bible thumpers and all these kind of things. One of my favorites is Kent Hovind. I'll leave a link in the description for you. But if you go looking for physical evidence of evolution, you're really not going to find a whole lot. There is very little fossil records. And even the fossils that they have, that they claim are these particular different eras or different ages, right? Because they have all these different ages for times, right? Even those fossils are locked up tighter than Fort Knox, and they actually require a special appointment to go look at the actual fossils. The fossils that you see in museums, Smithsonian and all these different museums, natural history museums, are really just copies, or supposed copies. When you do a plaster cast of something or you copy something, you can quite easily fill it in and make it into something that's not. I mean, how many people are going to call your bluff on that because they can't see the original, right? So you can put whatever you want out there and tell people this is a copy, and they're never going to say, okay, well, this is a copy and I came to see the original, so show me the original. And then follow through, make the appointment, and go through all this trouble to get to that point. I mean, you're talking about 1 or maybe 10, I doubt it. But you're talking about a small percentage of people that would go through all that trouble. I think most people are going to go through the museum, see what they think is a fossil, and keep it moving. And here's the thing. I point out all these things to emphasize that the theory of evolution, or the theory of the Big Bang, both of those things require faith, belief in something that is unseen, unsubstantiated, no proof of. Just as the reliability of the textbooks requires faith in those authors, I find it interesting that when we put some regulations on something and form a committee and make it all official, we never much hear anything else really about it. We seem to accept the reality that we are given, never questioning, never asking, who wrote this textbook? Why should I believe them? Let me ask you this question. How many planets are in our solar system way out there? If you had gone to school before the 2000s, you might answer 9. But that would be incorrect. If you had gone to school in the last 10 years, you might answer 8. That too is a bit incorrect. There are as many as 13 quote unquote planets out there. There are 8 plus 5 more called dwarf planets, which includes what we all used to think of as Pluto as a planet. Now, given this idea, and there's many more to go, the distance of the sun, for instance, is one. I think in the 70s they thought it was 3 million miles away in 70s textbooks. And nowadays it's 93 million miles away. And again, all this comes through observation. So one might argue that these facts have changed because of observation. But here's the real question. If science is just a series of observations, ever changing because of better and better equipment, when do these ideas stop evolving and just become a fact? You know, for that matter, what is a fact? If I'm learning something in a textbook this year and 20 years from now, that fact that I'm regurgitating to my teacher is no longer a fact, then what is a fact? And this is where we get back to the scientific method. Scientific method being observation, question, prediction or hypothesis, testing or experimentation, analysis, and finally conclusion. A scientific fact is a statement or evidence that has come as a result of repeatable experimentation. Simply put, someone did something, claimed it as a fact, someone else said, no, that's not a fact, you're wrong. They tested that fact by doing the same experiment, and they got the same result. And many scientists did the same experiment and got the same result. And because of that, it became a scientific fact. Now, is that the case when it comes to evolution or the Big Bang Theory? No, it's not. What has happened is all of these scientists have agreed that's the best theory there is. But they haven't agreed that these things are fact. So they put it out there as if this is the facts of the situation. This is how we got, like when you read through a textbook, there's no questioning. They say every statement that they have there is an authoritative statement. They say these things with authority. This is how it began. It rained for millions of years on a rock, and life just happened. Right? Which is horrible, because that's not science. That's a faith-based religion that they put into a book called a textbook. But there's no difference between that textbook and the Bible, as far as I've seen. I've gone through a lot of different things, trying to prove both of them wrong, the Bible and textbooks. And well, we'll get into the Bible when we get into that major religion, Christianity. As far as textbooks go, they're fallible, though. They're ever changing. Why do we have a new textbook every 20 years, 10 years, 20 years? As we went over in the last episode, God has been taken out of the equation, though. Meaning the existence of a supreme deity has been removed from speculation in the realm of science, in the realm of knowledge. As we take a little break, maybe we should ask ourselves, why has God been taken out of the equation? We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Jared Show Wisdom Podcast. Put simply, I think God has been taken out of the equation and been substituted by theories that hold long enough for each generation to grow up. And each generation after that one grows up learning a new theory because of supposed new discoveries. Yes. Scientism is the modern major religion. In textbook writers, scientists, and teachers we trust. Science itself makes sense, obviously. It's not science we should have an issue with. It's the layer or layers of theories that becomes so thick as to become fact. I think that's what we should have an issue with. When science became a religion was when we started relying on strange mathematical equations and theories instead of solid proof and evidence. The problem is, there really is no difference between believing in evolution and believing in creation, but that's not how it's presented. How it's presented is science versus religion. And religion is over here, and it's this, wishy-washy, feeling spiritual kind of thing. Whereas science is presented as over here, where these are facts. Right? But when you get into the facts of evolution, like I said, go watch Kent Hovind. Amazing presentations he has. He has hours and hours and hours of... He was a science teacher, and he has hours, he has whole series about everything that we're talking about here. And as far as I know, he was a science teacher that did not believe in a God, as far as I remember correctly. And a lot of scientists have been that way. The more that they study this world around us, especially things like DNA, atoms and molecules, the more that we study, the more that we know, the more it points to somebody that created things. By the way, I'm not sure if you know this. DNA, we'll get into DNA at some point. Not go too deep right now, but DNA is basically the building blocks for our gene makeup. So it tells whether I have blue eyes, brown eyes, green eyes, whatever, hazel, or brown hair, golden hair, whatever. It reads like a book, mostly. I think it's GTCA, I think is the letters that make up the human genome. And this DNA is very complex. Charles Darwin wasn't privy to that information. Charles Darwin knew nothing about DNA. They had not discovered DNA when Charles Darwin was writing his book in the 1800s, I believe. So he was not privy. He did not know about DNA back then. And DNA is what you might call a game changer when it comes to understanding, the earth around us and this physical plane of existence. And science has really just refused to abide by its own ideals, which is we're after the truth, we're after knowledge, and whatever knowledge comes our way, we're impartial to it. And if it comes down the pike that, this is either wrong or right, then that's what we go with, because we're seeking the knowledge and we're seeking truth. With DNA, it's like saying that, it's like looking at a car and saying it just appeared out of nowhere. When you go with the evolution idea, the Big Bang Theory. When you look at a building, when you look at a car, when you look at a book, you can see that it had a writer, it had a creator. When you look at DNA and how complex DNA is, it's amazing. And, actually at this point, scientists are actually starting to backpedal a little bit, especially when it comes to the Big Bang Theory. They are really having to admit that the Big Bang had to actually be caused by something. But again, the teenagers, the fifth graders even, that are learning all these things are not going to be taught that. What they're going to be taught is the Charles Darwin idea. They're going to be taught these ideas, the Big Bang theories, all these theories, as if they're, the fundamental basis, truth of everything. And they're not going to have that taught to them that, this is just a theory. We really don't know if this is correct or not. I remember being in school, maybe not being that young, but I remember being in school and thinking, like, this is a textbook. This textbook is 100% accurate. Right? There's no sense in even trying to prove that it's wrong. That's just a cop-out. I should just learn it, And it's interesting that as scientists are backpedaling from everything came from nothing, basically, then you have to have more theories on top of that, right? Because it's theory on top of theory on top of theory on top of theory. It's layers of theories. So now there's the theory that an asteroid hit the Earth and brought with it single-celled organisms. That's really because the prevailing theory doesn't work, that the Earth was a rock. It rained for millions of years, and somehow life just emerged out of nowhere, out of rain, out of water. And again, even with the new theory of things, that an asteroid hit or a meteor hit and brought life with it, it still begs the question, okay, well, where did that life come from? Science helps us gain answers, but only if we look at the facts. And as we have seen, sometimes what we can see, what we can test, and what we can do really only takes us so far. Here are the facts as we know them. Science cannot explain how we got here. Science cannot explain who we are. Okay, so the Big Bang doesn't explain how we got here. It goes all the way back, just goes back long enough to where you say, okay, well, that makes sense. But if you go all the way back to the very beginning of the Big Bang, there had to be a beginning to the beginning. See what I mean? So science so far does not tell us how we got here. If you go into evolution, there's gaps in that entire theory. There's gaps throughout the entire idea. So science cannot tell us who we are. And the biggest question, can it tell us where we are going? Well, perhaps if we follow science, it will lead us to something. So in that case, it can tell us where we're going, technologically speaking, I suppose. And by following science, I mean actually following science and saying, okay, well, science, this here, the pursuit of this, that's what I'm following, and then it's going to lead me to something. See what I mean? But overall, I mean, those are the three questions we're trying to get to. We've said that before. It's kind of our theme throughout here is, where do we come from? Who are we? Where are we going? Right? Science can't answer those questions. I mean, we can answer where we're going with science, perhaps, because we're using science and technology to do something with. But overall, science can't give us any answers. It can give us some ideas and some theories. But really, it shuts out ideas. Ideas about creation, ideas about a supreme deity. It really shuts those ideas out and substitutes a bunch of other ones. Again, now you have these other theories, a lot of like Michio Kaku and Neil deGrasse Tyson, these physicists and scientists, talking about, aliens, talking about amoeba hitchhikers from a distant planet on a asteroid that hit the Earth. Or just ridiculous ideas like the sheer volume of water over millions of years, creating things as if given enough water and enough time, life will just happen. Right? At the end of the day, science doesn't really tell us a lot as far as the big existential questions. It can tell us, we can use science itself to predict some things, but science, I think, is really for the study of the world around us as is and how these things work right now. We're gonna get into something, not now. I'm actually gonna get into this on the Knowledge podcast because I think it's really interesting, and I think it's fun to talk about. I love talking about it. It's so fun. It's called quantum mechanics, and with that goes a lot of different things: quantum physics, quantum entanglement, superposition, string theory, M theory. All these different things, getting smaller than atoms and molecules, getting into electrons, protons, and neutrons, getting smaller than that, what's in a nucleus, which would be like quarks, all these kind of things. But how the what we call laws, I guess you'd call them more like rules, apply on that particular level are astounding. And what's interesting about that is in that scientific field, it's called the quantum phenomenon or phenomena. And what's interesting about, and I want to get into it, I just don't have enough time right now. It's not something that really needs to be explored with what we're doing here. It is a deep subject. It's going to be fun to deal with that on the Knowledge podcast, but it's a realm of science that really kind of actually messes up the idea, the solidity, the validity, the solid state, the solid facts of science. If you get a chance, you want to jump ahead in the reading, if you will, go check out quantum mechanics and go check out the double slit experiment. Very interesting. But I think what we've seen here, from what we know, the facts that we understand, what we can see is science is a good way to understand the physical world, kind of as is, and maybe a little bit, in the past, kind of known recorded history, kind of up to where we're at now, and maybe a little bit in the future to do a little bit of predicting and figure out kind of some things, how these things are going to work. But going further back than recorded history requires a lot of leaps of faith, and as the old saying goes, do you believe in evolution? I'm not quite sure I have that much faith. So in this episode, we've seen how science, with all its facts and reasoning, which I agree with. I love science. I think science is great, but I think it's morphed into scientism with speculation, fancy mathematics, and really unproven theories at the end of the day. And I think now that we've gotten the first major religion, scientism, out of the way, I think we're a little bit freer to get into the next episode. In the next episode, we're going to move into another major religion, one I actually enjoy. I've studied quite often. I really like the general concepts. It's just the path it leads to and where you get to with this religion is not where you'd expect. So with that, it's going to be Buddhism. It should be an interesting episode. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe for more. New episodes every Monday and Wednesday night at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific. Thank you for listening. Truly. And as always, and in always, may God bless you. Thank you.